After 2 quiet days to kick off free agency, the Seahawks finally got in on the signings today. 4 outside signings in free agency. We're going to be breaking them all down in a jam-packed Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, here on our Wednesday episode by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week, including on my birthday. I got to start the show off with this, Rob, because I enjoy ripping myself. I enjoy making fun of myself, and turning 35 today, I officially feel over the hill. So our listeners made sure to make me feel even worse. So we're going to feel, I really loved this one coming from Christy Szymanski. Corbin Smith and Khalil Mack, possible newest Seahawks linebacker, needs to be in a reboot of the Twins or Grumpy Old Men movie. I enjoyed that one. This one coming from J.D. Thomas. Corbin, after going on runs, making Seahawks news happen with a walker. This old man is past his prime. And this is probably my favorite one from Chase Rydell. Live looking at Corbin not being able to blow out the candles anymore. I just had to post a few of those, Rob, because it was really fun. You guys made it a really fun birthday for me. And I'm looking forward to this show because the Seahawks decided to make this a very busy day for me on my birthday. So we're going to be diving into all the free agent moves, all the restricted free agent tenders, extensions, and some of the top guards and linebackers that are still on the market for the Seahawks to pursue. This jam-packed episode brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Now for your lead story here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. During the first 2 days of the legal tampering period before free agency started, the Seahawks were one of only 2 teams that had not signed an outside free agent. That changed dramatically, though, on Wednesday with 4 signings, a few of these names being familiar ones for Seahawk fans, or at least those of you in the Pacific Northwest. But we're going to start off talking about the biggest name of the 4 that were signed in terms of significance for this football team. Rayshawn Jenkins, who we talked about a couple times earlier this week. He visited with the Seahawks on Monday, Rob. A very versatile safety that can play in the box. He can play in the nickel as a slot safety. He can play single high. Maybe not elite at any of those things, but he's really good at all of them. And those are the kind of pieces that Mike McDonald is looking for as he tries to build a defense schematically that is similar to what he had in Baltimore.
Yeah, and well, first off, happy birthday, Corbin. I think it's awesome that the Seahawks were as active as they were on your birthday. You know, they wanted you to be active today, and of course, now you were forced to be. Let's start the conversation, as you said, here with Rayshawn Jenkins. And those of you who are watching on YouTube, thank you as always. You can read the statistics for yourself, but for those of you who are not watching on YouTube and listening, 101 tackles a year ago, 2 interceptions and 7 pass breakups. And Corbin, I think that the picture that you chose there of Rayshawn Jenkins jumping ahead, I believe that's Rashad Bateman, wide receiver for the Baltimore Ravens, and that's significant, of course. Just the fact that was one of the most impressive plays that I saw on tape of Rayshawn Jenkins this past season. He read Lamar Jackson's eyes and was able to step in front of the Baltimore wide receiver, be able to snatch a ball and just make one of the more instinctive interceptions that I saw on tape from a safety this season. And I love the fact that you mentioned the word versatility when describing Rayshawn Jenkins. It was the exact same word that we talked about before with Julian. Now I'm spacing on his name, but
Julian Love.
Exactly, Julian Love here, the Seahawks safety that they selected or that they drafted a year ago, and of course he wound up becoming a Pro Bowler for Seattle this past season, primarily because of his making some big plays, especially as an interceptor late in the season for the Seahawks. I like the fact that Seattle is going with some really interchangeable safeties. You think about Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams. Quandre Diggs is that classic free safety, the center fielder that can play multiple roles, and Jamal Adams definitely was that box safety, and you weren't going to see them interchange very much. I think that this makes Seattle much more versatile on the backside of their defense, and considering the talent that they're going to have as far as edge rushers and at the cornerback position, I think that it makes their defense that much more dangerous.
We don't know the financial details yet, but I've been told by multiple sources that Jenkins 2 years. So this is not a one and done type ordeal. Unless we see the contract structure, it could be an easy out after this year. But he's 30 years old. They clearly believe he's still got a lot of good football in him, and he had some great games for the Jacksonville Jaguars the last couple years. The Seahawks made 3 other signings in the last 24 hours, and really the first one happened last night at the final stage of the legal tampering period, and that is former Oregon tight end Pharaoh Brown, who played for the Patriots last year. He's been around the NFL. He's had 2 stints in Cleveland. He's been in Houston. He was with the Raiders to begin his career, and this is a player, if not for big-time injuries at Oregon, he probably gets drafted, but he went undrafted, and he has good size, almost 250 pounds, tall, lanky. Doesn't necessarily look like a guy that would be a great run blocker, and yet that's really where he's carved out his NFL career, is in the trenches. He doesn't have a ton of receptions. He's a capable receiver. Last year had several big plays in the passing game for New England, but his game is predicated on being able to block and win in the trenches, and you can move him around a little bit. So I think this is a quality chess piece at a good price, at maximum a little over $3 million, that you can put with Noah Fant and probably a rookie tight end coming into the draft.
Yeah, I mean, in yesterday's show, I mean, you kind of made a push for the Seahawks to sign a tight end that might be able to provide a little bit more oomph in the running game as far as a blocker. And again, I think the Seahawks just tried to, kind of give you that birthday present and maybe a couple of hours early. Pharaoh Brown's a good football player. You look at those reception totals, 13 catches this past season for only 208 yards. And then I think that people might think that this is not a guy that can be an impact in the receiving game, and yet when you watch his tape, the very few opportunities in which that he had, New England is very similar to Seattle. They basically had a 3-headed monster at tight end a year ago and didn't have the consistency at the quarterback position that the Seahawks, of course, had in their Pro Bowler, 2-time Pro Bowler in Geno Smith. Pharaoh Brown can provide some punch in the running game, a 73.3% blocking grade according to Pro Football Focus. But it's not just the numbers, it's on tape. I mean, he is long, he is physical, and again, he can make some catches and make people miss. I don't think that Noah Fant has anything to worry about as far as who's going to be Seattle's starter, but I do feel like this is not necessarily an upgrade over Will Dissly, but can play a similar role as Will Dissly in terms of being a blocker, but also being able to provide a little bit of a catch and better run after the catch opportunities that Uncle Will provide the Seahawks over his career.
Speaking of the University of Washington, where Will Dissly came from, the Seahawks bringing in their first player with connections to their new coaching staff. Scott Huff coaching Nick Harris at the University of Washington, a 2-time first-team All Pac-12 selection. Started his career in Cleveland, has been there the last 4 years, was a 5th-round pick. He's only started 4 games. He missed an entire season with a knee injury. So there have been some injuries in there. He couldn't beat out Ethan Posick, former Seahawks starter, who's actually been really good in Cleveland the last 2 years, really has rejuvenated his career, but under 300 pounds, but he packs more of a punch than you expect, and he's been really solid in pass pro dating back to his time at Washington. And I know that you loved Nick Harris coming out of the draft a few years back at Washington.
Yeah, he's just, I hate to say it, he's cat quick for a former dog, but that's exactly what Nick Harris is. I mean, he is quick to the second level. He is more powerful than you expect for a guy who is basically 6'1", 300 pounds. He's a little bit of a bowling ball out there. An excellent communicator, very light on his feet, good lateral agility. Look, I think that Now I'm spacing on names for the Seattle center again. Oluwatimi, I'm sorry. It's certainly my favorite to be the Seahawks starter at the center position this year. But Nick Harris gives you a quality veteran. As you said, Corbin, he was not the Cleveland starter this past season. Ethan Posick was. The upside that the Seahawks saw with Ethan Posick and all of his size and length, that really came to fruition here in Cleveland. But really, I think that Nick Harris is, frankly, a little bit of an upgrade over what that Evan Brown provided for the Seahawks a year ago. As their starter, I expect Oluwatimi to be even better than that. And again, I think that Nick Harris is a guy that is still young, that is going to provide the club with a quality backup that should be able to push Oluwatimi. And if Oluwatimi is not up to the challenge, Nick Harris will seize that job and be a starter for the Seahawks if necessary.
That wasn't the only addition Seattle made in the offensive line. The other one we don't have to talk about too much because Seahawks fans should already know George Fant. And I'm really intrigued to see when Noah Fant and George Fant are on the field. I mean, defenses, they're going to mix those two guys up. I mean, they're going to mix them up when they're bringing George Fant in as an eligible receiver, and maybe this time he won't trip over the turf monster. But honestly, getting to the seriousness here, this is a really good move because George Fant has been a competent starter in the NFL with a couple different teams. With the Texans last year, had solid pass pro numbers. And with Abraham Lucas's knee situation, coming off surgery, missing all the games he did last year, I felt like they needed to add somebody that could start for them if need be there. And George Fant can absolutely do that. He can play both tackle positions. He's evolved from an undrafted guy that had barely played football at the beginning of his career into a really solid NFL offensive lineman. So I love this for the fact that you can have him chip into either one of those tackle spots if needed. You can do 6 offensive linemen like they used to do with George Fant. And so this might be my favorite signing from a value standpoint because this is a guy that has started a lot of games in the league. And it gives you a true swing tackle along with Stone Forsythe. I think they've got a lot of depth now at that tackle position, which is much needed with what happened with Abe Lucas and concerns about his health. When we come back next, the Seahawks didn't just make moves when it came to signing outside free agents, a few of their own players coming back as well, including some restricted free agents and an unexpected extension. We'll get to those here in a moment on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Locked On Seahawks is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you do if you had an extra hour in your day? For me, I wish I had a little more time for painting and creating artwork. The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is know what's important to you and make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs and can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/lockedon. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. It was a busy first official day of the new league year for the Seahawks. We just broke down. They signed 4 outside free agents, including safety Rayshawn Jenkins and bringing back an old friend and tackle George Fant. But those were not the only moves that the Seahawks made today. They were very active with their restricted free agents, and there's a deadline when the new league year starts. If you're going to tender restricted free agents, you have to make that choice before the new league year opens. Seattle decided to place tenders on 2 of their players, and it looked like they decided not to bring back 2 of their players. Jake Curhan was not tendered, but Darrell Taylor is really the big storyline here. We weren't sure whether the Seahawks were going to bring him back with a new head coach, a new defensive scheme, and initially it looked like his tender was not offered. He was going to be an unrestricted free agent, but as it turns out, Rob, we don't know the length. We don't know the money value yet, but the Seahawks officially announced on their team website that Taylor is being extended. So that tells me that Mike Macdonald and the coaching staff, even with the inconsistencies we have seen from Darrell Taylor in his 3 years that he's actually played for the Seahawks and been healthy, they believe that they can maximize his athleticism and his skill set in this scheme.
Yeah, I think this is a really intriguing move for the Seahawks. Of course, I've championed Darrell Taylor for a long time now. I really see a different level of initial burst and bend around the edge than any other edge rusher that the Seahawks have. And that, of course, includes Boye Mafe. That includes Uchenna Nwosu. That includes, everybody on their squad. I just see untapped potential with Darrell Taylor. And I was very curious to see, because the Seahawks were going to have Taylor for one more year on that restricted deal. Of course, he missed basically his entire rookie season. Then would he come back even more motivated to have that splashy, quote unquote, final year in Seattle this upcoming season that, frankly, I was expecting him to have this last year? And then, of course, the Seahawks decided to move away from Pete Carroll. They brought in Mike Macdonald. You're going to expect a little bit greater physicality in the edge rusher role. But what I saw also was the 2024 edge rusher class. And I saw a lot of guys who have potential, but don't have a great deal of production, or have production, like Leatu Latu, for example, from UCLA, another former University of Washington player, and yet doesn't have necessarily the clean medical grade. And so a bunch of question marks rather than exclamation points at edge rusher in this draft class. And Corbin, I am 100% convinced that played a role in the Seahawks bringing back Darrell Taylor here, because I just think that they see a player that has a great deal of untapped potential. And maybe he can be, obviously he plays a different position, but maybe he can be the Justin Matabuke that Mike Macdonald helped bring the Baltimore Ravens a year ago. Matabuke could not be any more physically different than a player here in Taylor, who is 6'4" and 250 pounds soaking wet. But you do see untapped potential. I saw it with Matabuke when he came out of Texas A&M, and I was punching at the table, basically saying that I really think this is a guy who is going to be a superstar in the future. I think that Darrell Taylor can be that as well. I do think that he needs a little bit more just glass in his diet, being a little bit more physical at the point of attack. But still, I argued a year ago, or right about this time, I thought that Darrell Taylor could wind up leading the Seahawks in sacks this past season. Of course, that didn't happen. I do think that Darrell Taylor still has that potential to him. Seattle is getting bigger and they're getting more physical at the point of attack. I think that Taylor can be the guy who actually takes full advantage of that and becomes their pass rush specialist. So for your birthday, sir, I'm going to mention a player from we've talked about way back in the past, like a Rufus Porter and guys like that. That's who I've always thought that Darrell Taylor could be, that type of an elite speed rusher off of the edge. I think he could be one of the players that makes Mike Macdonald, and by extension, of course, John Schneider, look really, really smart during this free agent period.
I'm with you in the sense that I have always thought that the upside, the ceiling is there for Darrell Taylor. But the issue has just been, I don't want to say attitude, but the issue is that you just don't have the mindset there. It hasn't developed where you see a guy that wants to get after it in the run game and wants to play with the physicality that you have to play to be more than a third down pass rusher. He's been very solid in that role, albeit inconsistent. That's really been the biggest issue for him. Mindset isn't always there in the inconsistency. When he really hits as a pass rusher, we saw him get 6.5 sacks the last 6 games of the 2022 season. He can be dominant, but then you can go 4 or 5 games where he's barely noticeable, and you go through stretches where the only play you remember is that he's a 12th guy on the field blocking after Quandre Diggs gets an interception. I mean, that's the way that his career has gone. So I think this is a player that needs a different voice that I think is going to give a little bit more tough love. And Mike Macdonald and his staff are going to do that. And that's not a knock on Pete Carroll. I just think that this is a kid that needs a little bit more of that hard coaching to really get him to where he's going to play that physical brand of football. And if it doesn't work out this year, then he's not going to be back in 2025. Even if this is a multi-year extension, I would think it's not for a ton of money. They would be able to move on at that point. As far as the other restricted free agents, Mike Jackson gets an original round tender, which is a 5th round tender in his case, drafted in the 5th round by the Cowboys out of Miami. So if a team matches or gives an offer sheet and the Seahawks do not match that, they would get a 5th-round pick back in compensation, a little over $3 million. I think that is a justifiable deal for Mike Jackson when you consider that last year per PFF charting, he was the 19th best cover corner out of over 120 qualified corners that had over 200 coverage snaps, didn't give up a touchdown, had 4 pass breakups on 32 targets against him. He isn't going to get a lot of interceptions, not the flashiest athlete, but he just gets the job done. So it makes sense that he's back, and John Radigan getting the first right of refusal tender as an undrafted free agent. I would expect both these guys are now going to be back with the Seahawks in 2024. And Radigan now could be the captain of the special teams unit with Nick Bellore being released last week.
Well, not only the captain of the special teams unit, I mean, hell, right now he's the starter inside linebacker. I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
We've talked about, Drake Thomas and, the kid from Montana, Patrick O'Connell as possibly being Seattle starters. And that was because we didn't know for sure what was going to happen here with Radigan. But in terms of a guy who's got the shoulder width and just kind of a downhill kind of a nastiness, well, you can have some questions about the mental approach of a Darrell Taylor. You certainly are not going to have that with a John Radigan. I think that this is a good physical football player, plays with the mentality that you're looking for on special teams, as you mentioned, but also, again, as kind of that classic run stuffer that the Seahawks, frankly, right now are missing at the inside linebacker position. So I love all of these kind of underrated signs. Everybody's going to focus in on the new players being brought in. I like the players that the Seahawks are retaining. I think that that's kind of an underrated process throughout this kind of week of free agency.
And Nick Lee last week, when he was on the Friday show, we were playing this or that with free agency scenarios. And one of them was you had to pick either tendering Mike Jackson or bringing back Artie Burns. And I made the argument I would like to do both, but in the game, I couldn't do that. John Schneider just did both. And I think it's really smart because it puts a little pressure on Reek Woolen, most specifically. Hey, Mike Jackson is here. We can bench you in a heartbeat if you're not going to bring your A game. And Artie Burns showed he could play in the nickel in the slot, which is something he had never done before. And he played pretty well when they gave him those opportunities. So I think corner is a great spot to maintain the depth that you have. So being able to keep Artie Burns in a one-year deal, tender Mike Jackson, and then you're going to have your other corners as well. That is going to be a position of strength that now you're going to have to see if Mike McDonald, his staff, can maximize that. But I agree with you. I think today there's a more optimistic feeling among Seahawk fans, at least seeing the players that have been brought in. None of the big splashes. We didn't expect that after not being involved the first couple of days, but they're filling out some of their needs, and they're bringing back some players that aren't overly costly that could still have an opportunity to contribute for the Seahawks next season. There are still a few big holes, though, as we are going to attest to here on our next segment. The Seahawks still don't have a linebacker with starting experience, as you mentioned with John Radigan. And the guard position, there's still some major question marks there as well. We're going to dive into the best available players at those two positions who might be a fit still at this stage of free agency for the Seahawks. We'll get to that up next here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Game Time. You shouldn't have to worry or start ripping your hair out when you buy tickets to your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. They've got killer last-minute deals, and with all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Do you want to see an NCAA tournament game coming up in the first and second round? You can get those tickets with Game Time's awesome flash deals feature and a detailed stadium map. And you can find a cluster of tickets for one of those regionals now for under $250, and it's super easy. If you've been planning for months in advance or you're looking to make an impromptu trip, Game Time has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event. And Game Time's guarantee means you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, creating an account, and using the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening in nearby Vancouver, Washington, or in soon-to-be very snowy Denver, Colorado. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. It was a busy day for John Schneider and company. The Seahawks signing 4 outside free agents, tendering a couple of their restricted free agents, extending Darrell Taylor. It was a busy day, but that doesn't mean that they have addressed all their roster needs. There are still some gaping holes on this roster that the Seahawks are not going to be able to fill just with the draft. And we've been talking about linebackers ad nauseum. And unfortunately, Rob, one of the big names that was on the list we were talking about yesterday, a very familiar name for Seahawks fans, Bobby Wagner, is heading to the Commanders. That is actually where I predicted that he was going to end up, reuniting with Dan Quinn, his former defensive coordinator, as well as Ken Norton Jr., who is the linebackers coach in Washington. It was a great fit for Bobby Wagner, and the Seahawks unfortunately didn't seem interested in going back to him and trying to re-sign him. So Bobby Wagner's now off the list. We saw a couple other linebackers get signed today. There's still some star power at the top of this list, but the linebacker group is really drying up fast, and the Seahawks don't have any experienced starters at that position on the roster.
They do not. And as you said, there's still definitely some highly rated players that are available. I mean, Devin White was number 5 overall selection. Isaiah Simmons, I believe, went 9th overall in the draft. Jerome Baker of the Miami Dolphins was a first-round selection himself. So if the Seahawks want to go back down those doors, then they definitely have some inside linebackers with a great deal of pedigree behind them to go back. And if they want to kind of, as we saw in today, with the Seahawks bringing back George Fant, then if Seahawks want to go down that door, then Cody Barton, as we discussed on yesterday's show, is still available. So again, there are some options that are available to Seattle should they want to go down that door. Again, I would kind of preach patience here. We brought Mike McDonald in for a reason. And so I do think that Seattle doesn't feel that they are under the gun, so to speak, to bring in an inside linebacker. Let's face it, inside linebacker and running back are two of the positions that, at least historically, you are able to find in the NFL draft and be able to basically plug and play them. So again, while I would love to see Seattle bring in a player with all the aplomb of a Devin White, I just don't know that is where the Seahawks want to use the rest of their dollars. But it remains to be seen. Again, there are some options there that I think that the Seahawks are definitely going to be considering. I think that the more interesting position is actually at the offensive line. And again, left guard is a position of concern. At the right guard position, I presumably are going to be bringing back Anthony Bradford as the starter, and his game was up and down as it gets. And now you're assuming that you are going to have a new starter and Ola Oluwatimi at the center position, or perhaps the free agent addition of Nick Harris. Either way, it's not going to be Evan Brown, and so that means that Anthony Bradford is going to have somebody different than who he was starring at the center position next to him a year ago. And that just makes things that much more complicated. So there is, again, a list of free agent guards that are available that have some big names. I mean, Kevin Zeitler has been an all-pro. Dalton Reisner was a second-round selection years ago. Connor Williams, same kind of a thing, was a second-round selection. And then again, if the Seahawks want to go back to the names that Seahawks fans are going to know, then you not only have Mark Glowinski, who has spent the last couple of years the New York Giants, but Phil Haynes. You can bring him back as well. The point I'm trying to make here is that the Seahawks do have some options. I just don't know that any of them are going to be the upgrade over Damian Lewis. But again, it makes sense from a financial standpoint. Do you really want to dedicate that many dollars to a guard, that many dollars to an inside linebacker, when those are positions that feel like, with Mike McDonald, you have the expertise at the coaching position to be able to kind of get by with somebody other than giving them all kinds of money in free agency? Or dedicating the tens of millions of dollars that other clubs seem to be dedicating to guard positions in a draft class that is as loaded with offensive linemen as this one is. To me, this just kind of screams the John Schneider way. And so, again, I think that the Seahawks have some options here, but nobody out there who I'm like, oh, yeah, that's absolutely who Seattle is going to be signing here in the next 24 hours.
You know as well as I do, Rob, that John Schneider has been consulting with his scouts and his personnel department for the last several weeks. They have been looking at the position groups that they feel are strongest in this draft. And sure, we've talked about the offensive line across the board, tackles, guards, centers. There's depth, there's blue chip talent. This is a loaded offensive line class. So that may be what the Seahawks are thinking here, that we can wait till later stages in the free agency. We can bring back a Phil Haynes, or we can bring in a veteran at a cheaper price, and we can still use early draft capital on one or two offensive linemen. The risk with that, though, is if you have two openings at guard, it's really difficult to expect that two guards are going to come in and start on day one and be effective, even in this draft class. And so it feels like they've got to bring a veteran in at some point. And as you've thrown the names out there, I mean, Zeitler, I can keep bringing that name up just from the Ravens link with Mike McDonald, and he's a great pass protector. He can get after it in the run game. I think Dalton Reisner is a fantastic pass protecting guard. Run blocking, he's average at best. That is not a big strength for him. But if you're looking for somebody that can protect Geno Smith, Reisner is a really solid pass protector, and he's still a pretty young player. So those two are head and shoulders above everybody else is available. I think Glowinski as a stopgap player, he's been solid in New York the last few years. He had a couple good years in Indianapolis. He's a guy that I think could still come in a pinch and start for you and play fairly well. So there are some names out there. As far as I'm concerned, though, the linebacker spot is still the biggest issue here, because you have a handful of guys in this draft class that are going to be available in the second, third round, probably where they're going to go. And there's just not a lot of depth, especially if you're looking for 235 plus pound linebackers. There's plenty of those under 230 pound guys. I just can't see the Seahawks being interested in those kind of players. They want athletes, but you don't want an undersized athlete that's going to get bullied. So when you look at the free agent market, Devin White is clearly head and shoulders above everybody else, at least from a name recognition standpoint. He's capable of making a lot of splashy plays. Isaiah Simmons from the Giants, formerly the Cardinals, I don't know that he's a linebacker necessarily in the NFL. He was a safety in college. He's kind of been a positionless player. Maybe Mike McDonald thinks he can get something out of him in a Kyle Hamilton type role. Who knows on that front? He's certainly an athlete, but he needs to be coached up, and it just hasn't come together. And then there's a few other names that we've not talked about on here. Tyrell Dodson from the Bills was an undrafted player in 2019, and he actually was PFF's highest graded inside linebacker last year in the entire league, ahead of Bobby Wagner and a few other big names. Watching the film, I have some concerns about him holding up against the run as an every down starter. He only played about half the snaps on defense for them last year. There's also some character question marks for me. There was a domestic violence dispute. He was suspended early in his career. So there are some red flags to me on him, but he is certainly a younger player that could make some sense, that has starter upside. And if you're looking for a proven guy, Zach Cunningham, who's played for the Texans, the Titans, and most recently the Eagles, is a solid run defender that can get the job done. So if you're looking for a stopgap, there are some names out there, but we've done this in the last couple of days. There's been a bunch of names that we were talking about that are now gone, and it feels like in the next day or two that this list is going to be missing most of these guys. So if the Seahawks want to bring in a proven veteran linebacker or a younger linebacker that's still got some upside like a Simmons, they're going to have to get that done here in the next few days, or they're going to be in a situation where they're going to be picking the scraps at the bottom of the pile. They're not going to have a lot of options. And right now, they don't have many options on the roster. So that, to me, is still the biggest hole for this football team. As always, you can follow me on X at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, I'm going to have a special guest, Tony Wiggins from Locked On Jaguars, joining the show to break down Rayshawn Jenkins, the new safety for the Seahawks, and we'll dive into the latest news on the free agent roundup. Jam-packed episode coming your way. Make sure you're listening in and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Go Hawks.